Do you ever feel like you're struggling to create realistic and dense city blocks? This can be a challenging puzzle, and today we're going to be diving in on how to do this. So welcome back to the Build and Learn series. We're going to be focused on creating density. We're already at episode 5 of our Build and Learn series in Stanford Bay. And with that, it's time to start filling up our city blocks since most of our infrastructure and things are in place. So if you're new to the channel or the series itself, please be sure to hit the subscribe button, leave a like, and drop your comment down below as to what you think we should be working on in future episodes. And if you haven't checked out the previous episodes, there will be a whole playlist on the channel where you can catch up. In this episode, we're going to be taking about 4 city blocks and turning them into a really dense and vibrant area just outside of our downtown. This is going to bridge the gap from our taller city buildings into the rest of our city. So first, we're going to start off with a block that I really haven't done anything in. I don't have a predetermined building here or anything from previous episodes. We're going to start with this block and then we're going to move around into surrounding blocks until we fill up this area. One point that I've talked about in previous episodes is creating a fade from your peak, your tallest buildings, all the way down to where we are now at the outskirts of downtown. So whatever we put in this area needs to continue to tie in with the heights used at the edge of downtown and where we're moving towards as we head away from downtown towards suburbs and other stuff in our city. And getting ready for the episode, I had a few buildings that I wanted to utilize here that just sparked my attention. These are all in the asset list down below in the description for the video. Mixed use buildings or buildings that can kind of give you at least the impression that they're mixed use are really nice and helpful to use in certain areas where you're trying not to go full residential, but you want to combine that with commercial. While I'm using a lot of Steam Workshop assets, you've also noticed that I've used a combination of some vanilla assets. I'm going to continue to sort of balance this in a way. There are some commercial buildings that I will use in this space, and I think I mentioned in another episode that sometimes I just sort of pretend that they're mixed use, right? And they're not just buildings that are strictly commercial, especially when they're multi-story. I'm also going to be duplicating buildings. There will be some instances where I use buildings multiple times. For example, I like to create bigger apartment complexes than what maybe just one asset tends to appear. I've talked about utilizing some of the Brooklyn assets in the Content Creator Pack to create bigger apartment style buildings. A lot of those kind of buildings are sort of repetitive in nature, right? There's the same building based on like a template almost that are repeating down a street or in a city block. I want to utilize that sort of structure in some of my areas. One thing you may also have to consider depending on the size of your city block is breaking it up and adding little alleyways in between some of the buildings. This will continue to give you functionality on buildings you want to turn towards the center point of your city block, as well as adding just a little bit of diversity inside of that space. Sometimes I'll use things like pavement roads versus asphalt roads just to create this appearance that it's not some really built out road with lines and stuff like that. It's just an alleyway. In fact, sometimes I may not even actually put a road or an invisible road down even, and I'll just put pavement down in a way that makes it appear like there's some sort of alleyway or back access to the building. The road I'm currently using is a road from a pack called Surface Roads. This is something I haven't used before, but I figured this might help lend a little speed and pace to what we're trying to create here. Especially because variations of the road actually come predetermined with a cul-de-sac on the end node. Visually, I prefer that over just a road ending in sort of a vanilla way. Some of these decals that I'm placing are non-functional. Cars are not naturally going to go park here. This prevents one thing. That is where cars will just drive through buildings or sort of take weird routes to get there. Some of the parking lots I'm placing down that are buildings are actually functional parking lots, and cars will maneuver into that parking lot from the alleyway road to which it's attached. Now, if you do have some of these decal parking spaces that are non-functional, you can always put prop cars in them. Detailing in any capacity is a helpful way of adding density. In fact, I'm going to be adding some details to some of these blocks as we progress. This is to help add the density that we're talking about. It's not all just building and building selection. Given that density is really talking about how much space an object can take up, I'm looking to find a bunch of objects that can contribute to taking up space. So in addition to buildings, there's also trees, bushes, various props and assets that you can place. And then just from a flat surface perspective, you could always go in and add decals down. I'm going to be using a limited amount of details for right now. It's going to help add some diversity to the concrete and pavement that's pretty much everywhere within the city, or will be at least. Much like I did when I was setting up our downtown, sometimes I'll place a bunch of buildings down and I'll see sort of what fits by moving them into place, moving them out, back and forth until I find something that works. Again, I liken this to building a puzzle. Kind of like a puzzle, you have different shapes that you need to fit into certain areas, and that is so similar to how this process goes for me. It's a lot of times I'll put down a couple buildings, they don't work, I'll step away from it, come back, reset, and do it again. You don't have to fully commit to what you're setting up the first time. Sometimes it's going to take a few tries until you start to figure out this process. I would always recommend trying to find ways of combining buildings. For example, these Brooklyn Content Creator Pack buildings are really helpful, like I said before, at creating denser, larger apartment complexes. Utilizing them on the front and the back, they're easy to combine, and there's multiple different assets that you can use that can all sort of work together or play separately. Something else you're going to see me try to do is figure out ways of incorporating some green space into these areas. So where I have natural breaks in the pavement, I'm going to probably try to incorporate some bushes and trees and just vegetation into those spaces. And one helpful asset in terms of filling up some of these city blocks, especially when you're maneuvering buildings around like this, and you have those little tears where grass is showing up in spots you don't want it, is the kit of brushes I talked to you guys about in the last episode. These can help patch up areas, and they work better, in my opinion, than surface painter, because surface painter will tend to leave this like tear in certain areas, or you'll have to overuse surface painter to cover up things. Another little challenge you can do while you're placing down your buildings is look for unique things that the buildings have that you can sort of feature or bring out a little bit, right? By adding different props or assets. So for example, this corner building has a little cafe looking area outside. I'm going to use decals to make it stand out even more. Something as simple as that, just a decal added here with some texture to it, starts to give you a little bit more of a busy appearance, which is something we're looking for. Something else you can look at when you're putting these buildings down, even vanilla buildings, is find flaws in sort of how they're set up. For example, these buildings come complete with trees. Well, trees typically don't just grow through perfect concrete, so we're going to add planters. Another simple thing that you can do to start adding a little bit of texture, just something else that your eyes are gonna see when you're kind of looking at these buildings. It's another piece to this density puzzle. Something that stems from my background in like videography and photography is always seeing like shadows and how shadows are cast and how that tends to add complexity to the image and make things look less flat. For example, when I'm just in City Skylines and I'm trying to take a screenshot that I want to share, I tend to play with the sun position enough so that I can cast just the right amount of shadows to make certain buildings stand out more. It's a kind of easy way to make things look a little more dynamic or draw attention to certain stuff. And things like 3D props, they all cast shadows. Your bushes, your trees cast shadows, and to me that just adds a little bit of another layer of visual texture onto your buildings, your sidewalks, or wherever you're placing things. I've also started using some pre-decorated planters in some areas just to help reduce some of the load when it comes to decorating every neighborhood or every street. While these are in my asset list in the description, I would highly recommend checking them out, especially if you're looking for ways of reducing some of the load when you get into decorating. One detail-oriented thing that doesn't really always exist in-game that's kind of a helpful little piece to add is things like fences. Obviously, there's decorative fences that you can use to help separate like the cafe from the sidewalk. You can also use fences to help dictate property lines, which I think is a kind of a helpful thing to add just a little bit of detail to things like your suburbs. They can also be helpful in separating things like parking lots or certain businesses from one another. Now, while adding diversity to things that you're placing, I would remember one thing. A lot of times when you have something like an office or an apartment building, they may reuse some things. For example, certain trees may be specific to their buildings and they want to reuse those whenever they get the chance. Maybe certain planters are the same or the bushes within the planters are the same. Same with certain tiles or textures that they might use on the ground. So you may see me use a lot of the same trees, some of the same bushes, some of the same planters. I use that for reducing assets, but I also use it to tie in with certain buildings. Now keep in mind that I'm not going to go completely away from the theme of the city. I still want the city to be close to the water with a little bit of a Florida vibe, but I'm also going to use some different trees and things that help kind of separate certain areas or make it look like they were specifically planted to be there. As you zoom in, consider what might be on a sidewalk, right? Typically, you're going to see benches and bins or trash cans. You'll see planters, bollards, maybe ads. There's a ton of stuff that you can do to continue to add different layers to what you're setting up. If you're playing modded, there's a few mods that you should keep in mind that are going to help you detail much more efficiently. Obviously, there's Move It. Move It is great for positioning pretty much anything or everything, and I use it all the time. I also utilize Picker, which is the eyedropper tool on the bottom right. This is really helpful because I can utilize Picker to pick an asset and it'll actually find it for me again. Additionally, it offers a recall function where it retains certain assets that you've used recently so you can grab that asset again on the fly. And then there's Prop Line tool, which is super helpful for me, especially when I'm doing landscaping. Prop Line tool allows you to create lines of props or assets that you're using, and you can customize the spacing. You can even angle the props and assets to meet what you're looking for. It's super helpful, and it reduces having to do everything one by one. Now with Move It, obviously I can go in and I can copy and paste certain things. So I can set up something that I want to use in multiple places, paste it down somewhere else, especially if I'm trying to keep to a specific theme within that area. Now for a moment, I'm going to show a little bit of a time lapse of me detailing. Some of this is just to get us a little bit faster through the video so that I can show you more of some of the blocks I'm going to fill out. If you struggle at figuring out how to landscape certain areas, I would first take bushes and border some of your pockets of grass. This will help cover up mistakes or weird edges, especially along the pavement when you start adding buildings and other assets in. If you don't want to cover it with the brushes or surface painter, you can sometimes cover edges just with some plants and trees. So much of detailing is really just about trying to cover up weird things that the game does or mistakes that you're just not sure how to fix. So don't be scared about using it just to cover up something that looks a little funky or unrealistic. I can't say enough about these network planters by Avania. They are super helpful. They come in a couple different variations. You can get them also undecorated. So if you want to do your own plants in them, you can do that as well. These are on the workshop and they should be in my asset list down below. Would highly recommend checking these out as an easy way to help you learn maybe how to landscape some areas or add decorations on top of pavement or next to buildings. Now, I don't think I'm doing anything that extravagant. Instead, I'm just trying to add basic things to some of these streets and sidewalks just to fill up the space and not make it seem so empty, which is a critical thing in trying to add the density that we want, right? But I will say it's important to get those buildings down first, and it's also really helpful to look for buildings that you want to use that also have some of their own textures and things applied to them, or just their own detailing. For example, if there's trees or bushes that look relatively good, I would check those buildings out because that can lighten the load of you having to detail everything, unless you want that sort of control. One thing I probably don't do enough of is adding planters as bollards and then putting trees or bushes in them. Just something a little bit different that's not really built into the main game that you can add. I mean, obviously some assets have that kind of stuff, but adding that plus bollards, you start to have a lot of little things up on the sidewalk filling some of that dead space. And then once you have pedestrians in there, it looks rather busy. Now that we have that first block set up and relatively well detailed, let's move on to our next block, which is by the city library we placed down in the last episode. Now, pretty much wherever I go in the city, I want to try to make sure our condos and some nice offices and things are all facing the water. They're all going to be next to our beaches or wherever the water sort of runs, maybe near the river as well. So I want these nice buildings to be featured in a way, but then behind them, I'm going to start using some of these offices and sort of generic buildings to fill space. Whenever I can go on the workshop and I can find asset packs of like generic office space, I'm super excited because that's something I can use multiple times all over the place and I can kind of build it out the way I want, especially if it has a little bit more of a modular approach. So while the building facing the water is all pretty with glass and you know it's a nice condominium or apartment complex, right? I can stick some of these buildings in areas that you're not going to notice as frequently. These buildings are so significant because sometimes if they're modular, you can place them in kind of funky spaces where you just need something to fill an area and you just don't really know what to go to. Again, finding asset packs like this are really, really welcome when I'm setting up my asset list for a city build. They may be your less featured buildings, but they're going to serve a really cool purpose. And because they're not as ornate maybe as some of the buildings you have, for example, that are featured are on the coastline, they're still going to be really, really powerful in terms of how they operate because they're going to make some of those buildings stand out even more. And then when you have something as helpful as the repaint mod, I can change the color so I can get certain buildings to match as if they're a part of the same unit, or I can add some diversity with making one a different color, and I can utilize them elsewhere with different colors so they don't look as repetitive. All in all, don't be scared to reuse buildings. Don't be scared to use the repaint mod just to make slight variations and changes. And ultimately, don't be scared to copy a building and paste it and put it back to back with the same building. I was struggling at finding a building to fit behind here, so I just figured, why don't we just add another tower to this sort of complex? Granted, it's on an alleyway, but I think it kind of works. It adds one more building to this space, making it a larger complex. It can be challenging to figure out how to sort of combine buildings, whether the same building or slightly different. You know, it's an interesting thing to kind of play with, but I think it's more of an advanced way of figuring out how you can utilize buildings repeatedly throughout your city, or just add, again, structures to the same building to make it seem larger. Kind of like we did in the city services video, where we were taking certain city service assets and combining them to make them seem more substantial and more realistic in my eyes. Much like we did in the first city block, we're going to utilize parking on this alleyway to create just some spaces that can be utilized. And this is also, again, something that'll be populated by Sims, so you'll have a little bit of an interesting thing going on there as cars pull in and out of it. Now, remember, when you have some of these awkward spaces, like this little triangle-ish space here, you can start working towards adding green space. By using just simple vanilla pathing and some plants and bushes, maybe some benches, you can create your own little area here that's like a little mini park. And considering it's next to a public library, I think that kind of makes sense. An alternative idea is to look for commercial space, maybe 1 to 2 stories high that can kind of fit at this angle, merge them together side by side, and see if you can make a little shopping center type of space. But for now, I'm going to leave this as green space, and we'll be tackling more of the shopping center kind of stuff as we progress through the city build. Something you can try with pathing as simple as this is to insert organic lines when you have very, very strong, like straight gridded lines. So we have a lot of grid system in this city. Adding these little organic pockets where you have curved lines is actually a really nice way to complement each other. The juxtaposition there tends to be nice. A really helpful asset I want to tell you guys about that I tend to love are these little clusters of bushes. There's some flower bushes that are sort of like wild, and there's also just some greenery bushes. These can be really, really cool to make little wild gardens. Would highly recommend checking them out. They're on the asset list. You can get these and fill in little pockets with these, wild or sort of in the city, and they're really, really nice. And they're kind of fun to add a couple trees to and some other bushes. They look great. Just find opportunities to mix up some of your detailing with different types of trees, bushes, and things like that of various heights, giving you some changes in verticality and also some differences between like pavement and grass areas. That can be really helpful in adding some texture. I'm going to drop in some fences around the parking lot just to change up what we're doing a little bit. We have this little green space. I've added some network planters. Now I want to shift away from that and add something that's less organic. Much of this city block is going to be about little pockets of green space. Part of that is because of the awkward shape, especially around this corner area. But then I'm also thinking that the city probably owns this whole section here. So I'm going to leave some of it green space, like they just sort of allotted this to be public library and a little bit of park space just to create their own little carved out area. Now I'm going to speed through the rest of the details added to this city block, primarily around the public library. Part of that is because I want to show you guys the next city block without taking up a ton of time on planting trees and things like that, although that is pretty important. As you can see, when you begin filling these areas, your blocks seem much more dense and planned. So while finding the right building combination to fit in a specific space is critically important to setting up your area, and probably the first thing you need to be doing when you're trying to figure out how to fill up a city block, your detailing and the ability to add different props, trees, vegetation, whatever you choose is very helpful in filling up a lot of that space that you can't normally just stack a building in. And something I would keep in mind as you're progressing through your city blocks is take time to do some of these things. Don't just spread a bunch of city blocks out without confronting the fact that they still look empty without some vegetation or just a few props, maybe a parking lot or something along those lines. That way you don't get too overwhelmed by having to do so much detailing later. Sometimes I set up all these blocks and I forget to go in and do any detailing, and then I'm like overwhelmed at the fact that I have so many blocks to do. So find times you can revisit it or utilize it as something to go back to when you're stuck somewhere else. Now here's a block that has a very odd shape to it. It's narrow on one end, wide on the other end, it's angled. There's a lot of complications here in terms of being able to put down buildings. So much like I did in other areas, I'm going to utilize some green space to help us kind of counter the fact that this is an odd space. I'm going to use this one long office building to help fill the area, but then I'm also going to use several smaller commercial buildings and kind of unite them in a way so that they fill the other end. Now, utilizing the smaller commercial buildings can be a really handy thing, and we talked about combining buildings earlier, and I think commercial buildings often lend themselves to doing this. You have a lot of commercial buildings that just are smaller. And with some of the newer assets added to cities, you have some different options now to make very nice, modern looking commercial spaces. However, placing them by themselves tend to look empty, right? We want to add something to this, and we don't want to just put a parking lot in some of these spaces. I want to build it up so it looks dense. So specifically when I'm in like downtown, midtown type areas, just outside of the main city center, I want to combine commercial. I rarely am going to put commercial in a position just to stand alone, especially when it's isolated buildings. That's different from like a shopping center, right? And in a similar fashion, I'm going to use some of these other buildings on the backside, and I'm going to combine a couple to take up the space. So while earlier we were utilizing bigger buildings to take up more space, duplicating buildings and then combining them in some fashion, now I'm taking smaller buildings and I'm kind of using the same method. I'm looking for opportunities to combine buildings so that it appears more dense while also keeping stylistically similar, right? I want modern commercial spaces. And by merging them into one city block, you have a whole area that Sims can go and visit and hang out in, maybe even work in. I'm leaning on things I know too, because I've seen these type of spaces exist in larger cities. And I've always said, build what you know, build what you're used to, or build what you can reference at minimum. Sometimes I look at things that I know or I've seen and I try to replicate that my own way, not really like a one-to-one, but just trying to get the impression, right? I take inspiration from things that I see. And by doing so in something that is this dense with a city so close, every piece of land is so valuable, you really want to crush things together. You don't want to have plots of land with just nothing in them, unless it's just small pockets of green space because a company hasn't filled that space yet, or whatever you can do to make it feel very lively and vibrant with all these different elements added to your city. I've mentioned this in previous episodes, but it's always giving your city purpose, and that breaks down even into the city blocks. What is the purpose of this space? What does it do? How is it serving the community, this city block, this region, whatever your scale is? Give it some sort of meaning. Create a backstory. and sometimes that'll help guide you through even the smallest little things that you're trying to work through. In addition to detailing the couple of city blocks that we've created, I've also gone in and added details around the hospital and the police station. It's crazy how selecting buildings and filling that space, along with adding just basic details, how much of a difference that can make in creating realistic city blocks. Not only are Sims ready to move in here, this is going to meet basic functionality needs like commercial, hospital, residential, and office space. So make sure you give your spaces purpose, diversify the buildings based on what you need or what you want in a certain area, and find ways of adding details to continue to give it texture and life and really make it pop. So much of this is a puzzle, so take your time at finding the assets, lay them out in front of yourself, and pick them and kind of like move them into place until you find the mix that works for you. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or suggestions, please leave them in the comments down below. Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. I would really appreciate it. Be sure to stay tuned as we have plenty to do in upcoming episodes, and I'll catch you on the next one.